In 1957, a huge explosion tore through a secret nuclear weapons facility in the USSR, exposing an estimated 450,000 people to dangerous radiation, claiming around 8,015 lives, and making it the world's worst nuclear disaster behind Chernobyl and Fukushima. In fact, it was the first ever major nuclear disaster in history. Yet the so-called Kishtim disaster was covered up by the Soviet government for decades, a cover-up that ultimately cost thousands of lives and hid a story of human experimentation, catastrophe, conspiracy, and criminal malpractice. So how could a massive nuclear disaster break out without anyone knowing? What truly happened in those horrific human experiments? To find out, we'll have to time travel back 80 years to World War II, specifically the 6th and 9th of August 1945. You see, it all began when the US pulled off the terrifying feat of bombing the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This mighty display of destructive power showed off their flashy new nuclear weapons program and effectively ended the war. In response, leader of the Soviet Union and majestic mustache wearer Joseph Stalin decided Russia's nuclear program needed catching up to speed if they were going to compete with America's atomic achievements. So he chose a secret location 1,000 miles from Moscow in the Ural Mountains, and in 1948 had 40,000 Gulag inmates and prisoners of war build the Mayak Production Association, a nuclear facility. At Mayak, plutonium materials for nuclear weapons were produced and reprocessed. In fact, it had the honor of supplying components for the Soviet Union's first ever nuclear device, RSD-1, which exploded a year later. Nowadays, we know that Mayak was based in the closed city of Chelyabinsk in the Chelyabinsk Oblast. Only authorized personnel were allowed inside, and the Soviets even kept it off the maps. Officially, it didn't exist. Today, it has a different name, Ozersk, but its tragic past still haunts the place. Here's how it all worked. The nuclear reactors had Mayak produce plutonium-239 by placing uranium-238 fuel rods inside the reactor, where they were bombarded with neutrons generated in a nuclear chain reaction. When uranium-238 absorbs a neutron, it turns into uranium-239. Uranium-239 is very unstable, so it quickly decays into neptunium-239, which in turn decays into plutonium-239, the isotope used in nuclear weapons. Got all that? Next, the plutonium undergoes reprocessing, where the spent fuel rods are dissolved in nitric acid. This liquidizes them and at the same time oxidizes the plutonium. Then acetic acid, the main component in vinegar, and a base, a substance that neutralizes acids, are added to the solution. When they react, they transform the uranium and plutonium into solid acetate salts, helping to chemically separate plutonium from uranium and other radioactive materials. This separation process leaves behind a liquid radioactive waste containing residues of acetate and nitrate solutions, cesium-137 and strontium-90. So where did all that liquid waste go, you ask? Well, it actually ended up in two places, the local Lake Karachay and the Teka River. I wish I was joking. Unsurprisingly, this haphazard handling of incredibly dangerous nuclear waste caused significant environmental problems. Lake Karachay in particular is considered the most contaminated lake in the whole world. Seriously, at one time, one isolated corner of it was so radioactive that just standing nearby for a mere 30 minutes exposed you to a lethal dose of radiation. You'd only have a 50-50 chance of surviving. Damn. Now that doesn't mean there's a 50% chance you die within 30 minutes, which is something, I guess, but it does mean there's a 50% chance you die an agonizing drawn-out death instead. Oh, great. So I know what you're thinking. What if you dipped your foot into the lake outright? Well, initially you might think that incredibly stupid decision had paid off and made you look really cool. But within hours, nasty burns and tears would appear all over the contaminated area. And that would only be the beginning. If left untreated, the radiation could fatally spread, making amputation the best option. Jeez. So you guessed it, swimming would be an even worse idea. To grasp just how insanely radioactive Karachay was, you've got to look at the numbers. Radioactivity is measured in units called curies and becquerels, which represent how many atomic decays happen per second. The higher the rate of decay, the more radioactive something is. 1 becquerel means 1 decay a second, whereas 1 curie, that's an astonishing 3.7 billion becquerels, and that's from just 1 gram of a radioactive substance. Now get this, Lake Karachay ended up contaminated with over 120 million curies of radioactive waste. That means it was blasting out about 444 quadrillion decays or becquerels every second. For comparison, the Chernobyl disaster in 1986 released around 50 million curies, less than half. So yeah, Karachay wasn't just radioactive, it made Chernobyl look like a slightly spicy soda, which is pretty terrible. But at least you know nobody drank from Lake Karachay, because the Teka River, the other radioactive dumping ground, was the main drinking source for 39 settlements with a combined population of 124,000. Oh, and it was a popular hangout and swim spot for kids. Say what? From 1949 to 1952, an estimated 100 quadrillion becquerels of liquid waste was discharged into the Teka Isitobel Irish Ob River system. 95% ended up in the Teka itself between 1950 and 1951 before Lake Karachay took over as the primary dumping site. Additionally, river water was also diverted for use at the Mayak facility to cool the nuclear reactors as fission reactions generate immense heat. Water from the nearby Lake Kiziltash was circulated through the reactor systems, absorbing heat from uranium fuel rods. Now contaminated, it was returned to local rivers and lakes without treatment. The extremely poor management of nuclear materials caused unsafe radiation exposure to over 17,000 Mayak workers between 1948 and 1958. And all that dumping of radioactive waste caused breakouts of sickness in villages for many years. One such village, Muslomovo, was situated on the very banks of the Teka River. Because the level of contamination was so high there, in 1953 a specialized medical center now known as the Urals Research Center for Radiation Medicine was set up specifically to study the impacts of radiation on the villagers, without their knowledge. Shamefully, the secret surveillance of the locals' deteriorating health continued for a very long time, but more on that sinister story later. Eventually, some rational thinking prevailed amongst the Soviets, and in 1953 storage facilities for liquid nuclear waste were finally added to Mayak. These consisted of stainless steel tanks on concrete bases buried 26 feet underground. The design allowed the waste to be safely stored and decay over time, gradually reducing its radioactivity. A cooling system was also installed to regulate the temperature and prevent the tanks from overheating. Unfortunately, the system was poorly maintained, and in 1956 a pipe leading to one of the tanks broke. Fixing it would have meant digging up the tank, finding the leak, and replacing the pipe, so naturally the engineers decided not to bother and instead turned off the water and left it as is. As a result, the tank's internal temperature grew progressively hotter for over a year. Without the cooling system, the heat continued to build until by the 29th of September 1957 it reached a blistering 660 degrees Fahrenheit. It was on this day that the heat and pressure finally became too much to bear. At 4:20 p.m., the tank exploded with the force of up to 110 tons of TNT. The 3-foot-thick concrete lid weighing around 176 tons was blown off, and roughly 88 tons of radioactive waste surged out. The blast was so powerful it destroyed a brick wall in a building that was over 650 feet away. The incident released massive amounts of cesium-137 and strontium-90, both highly radioactive isotopes, into the air. These isotopes are incredibly dangerous, spreading radioactive particles that can contaminate air, soil, water, humans, animals, basically everything in their path. It's estimated that 20 million curies of radioactivity were released across the region, 90% of it settling near the disaster site and along the Teka River. But that wasn't the end of it. A radioactive plume containing 2 million curies spread far beyond the immediate area over the next 10 to 11 hours. This toxic cloud drifted northeast for up to 217 miles, contaminating over 7,700 square miles and impacting over 270,000 people. One of the most heavily affected zones is a 380 square mile area known as the East Ural Radioactive Trace. Here, strontium-90 contamination levels were recorded at up to 10 curies per square mile, far above the so-called safe threshold of less than 5 curies per square mile at the time. When the disaster struck, 63% of this EURT zone was used for agriculture, 20% was covered in forest, and over 20 rural communities were scattered throughout it. But keep in mind, this is just the traceable area. Because radioactive particles can travel long distances on the wind and by weather, the full fallout zone is believed to be even larger. All in all, the entire area of contamination is estimated at approximately 20,000 square miles, roughly the size of West Virginia. This nuclear catastrophe is officially known as the Kishtim disaster, named after the nearest town marked on the map since Ozursk wasn't. And no, the ground didn't start to glow green. But what followed was something much worse. Pure dystopian horror. In the immediate aftermath, those that were physically caught in the blast experienced the skin on their hands, faces, and other parts of their body literally slough off, essentially peeling away from the sheer force and heat. Yeah, I couldn't even imagine that level of pain. As for those who were a little further away and merely got irradiated, they didn't turn into superheroes, unfortunately. Instead, a whole bunch of dangerous medical conditions awaited them, including premature death, sadly a fate that befell many of the villagers living near the Mayak facility. After a week, doctors were finding children exposed to concerningly high amounts of radiation. A Geiger counter placed against one child's stomach revealed exposure readings of 40 to 50 microroentgens a second. For reference, the nearby town of Berdyansk produced background readings of 350 to 400 microroentgens per second, which will have you buried in just 4 weeks. And that's if you're an adult. In most European countries, natural background radiation levels are just 20 microroentgens per hour. Outside of the 3 closest villages, tens of thousands continued to live in contaminated areas completely unaware of the invisible radiation surrounding them. They carried on eating the meat from their own livestock until around a week after the disaster when things took a disturbing turn. Cows and chickens began falling visibly ill, some even bleeding from the mouth after grazing on radioactive grass. Streams, lakes, and acres of farmland were covered in radioactive soot. Pine needles on nearby forests yellowed, curled up, and died, and this devastation of vegetation wasn't temporary. It lasted for 3 to 4 years after the incident. In short, practically everything around the facility was getting sick. So disaster had struck, big time. But what did the government do in the midst of all this nuclear chaos? Well, firstly, I imagine they panicked a bit. Then they made plans to keep word of the incident as secret as humanly possible. I can barely keep a secret from my parents. How did Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev and his cronies manage to cover up a nuclear catastrophe? Simple. They suppressed all news coverage that exposed the truth and didn't tell any of the residents living nearby what had happened. Yep, even when they had to conduct a cleanup, they kept it firmly under their hats. From the 2nd of October, villagers immediately closest to the blast zone were required to slaughter their livestock, bury their crops, and plow their farmland like nothing was amiss. Families harvested wheat, stacked it, then set it all on fire. Highway signs popped up warning drivers not to stop for the next 12 to 18 miles. The land was now empty and practically swimming in radioactive particles. While some settlements in the EURT were evacuated, those areas registering below 5 curies per square mile were still considered harmless. Of course, that was far from the truth. In the village of Karabolka alone, 300 of the 5,000 residents died of radiation poisoning within days. Yet villages like this weren't evacuated for months. In fact, it took 2 full years to relocate 10,000 people from the surrounding area due to the sheer lack of urgency. Ultimately, over 20 villages were left razed and abandoned. No official explanations were ever given, no protective equipment, no support. And when the government finally did clear Karabolka 250 days after the explosion, they only evacuated ethnic Russians. Those that weren't, like the local Tatars, a mostly Muslim Turkic-speaking population, were left behind. Many believed they'd been abandoned deliberately, and they were probably right. Because what happened next? it wasn't just radiation, it was something even darker. Get ready for some truly evil twists and turns. Remember that village I mentioned earlier, Muslimovo? Well, it went through similar evacuation procedures with many of the less desirable locals left behind completely. Bear in mind, these poor villagers still didn't really know what was happening. Some may have had suspicions, heard whispers of a disaster or rumors of a Soviet cover-up, but for the most part, they were left in the dark and made to think their settlement was safe. See, Muslimovo was one of the towns hit hardest by the Mayak explosion, which made it the perfect case study for all the wrong reasons. Soviet leaders saw it as an ideal setting to conduct natural experiments. Radiation experts monitored the town for years, studying the long-term effects of radiation exposure on its 8,000 residents. They tracked their health, recorded symptoms, and quietly gathered data, information they believed would be invaluable to the Russian government if nuclear war ever broke out. But all that came at a horrific cost. These villagers weren't just subjects, they were sacrifices. Yep, they purposefully left people in a highly radioactive zone and watched as they slowly got sicker and sicker. Damn. And despite official claims, recent evidence suggests that liquid radioactive waste continued to be dumped into the Teka, which was used as drinking water by the Muslimovo locals. It wasn't actually bright green, but it may as well have been. Could they have carried on dumping to actively ensure the villagers were exposed to as much radiation as possible? It's a dark thought, but not an unlikely one. All the while, residents were still not told about the research being conducted on them or the real reason so many of them were falling ill. In 1959, Soviet scientist A.N. Marie even wrote a dissertation arguing that the Teka River villagers were sick because of their poor diets, conveniently omitting that those poor diets consisted of irradiated water. In total, the health decline of not just Muslimovo residents, but 28,000 people living along the Teka River was being examined by doctors of the Ural Center and the Soviet Institute of Biophysics in Chelyabinsk. Doctors invited people to take blood samples and more gruesomely collected the irradiated body parts of those unfortunate people who'd passed away. Even more gruesomely, they collected genetically malformed babies who'd never made it past infancy and stored them in glass jars like some awful freak museum. One child apparently had rough skin like a burlap sack, while another had eyes on top of his head like a frog. Damn. Despite the government's best efforts to suppress any explosive reports, records of a nuclear accident and its aftermath began appearing in the American press as early as 1958. However, the Soviets still avoided issuing any official statements confirming what had actually happened. They continued to keep the Mayak facility off the maps, and the residents of Ozersk at the time were erased from the Soviet census to keep the incident secret. When residents reported seeing strange lights in the sky on September 29th, an eerie byproduct of the radioactive ash cloud, the newspapers dismissed it as a polar night phenomenon related to the Northern Lights. The problem? The Northern Lights don't usually appear that far south in this region of Russia, and they're blue and green, not gray and black. Even with these silly excuses, the full scale of the disaster remained hidden from the rest of the world until Russian biologist Zharez Medvedev came along. In 1976, nearly 2 decades later, Medvedev wrote an article for the British New Scientist magazine about the disaster, finally taking it public. He described how tens of thousands of people were affected, with hundreds dying. Though doubts initially arose over the validity of the article, Medvedev's account was later confirmed by ex-Soviet physicist Leo Tumerman. In 1961, Tumerman had witnessed for himself the abandoned lands and villages, recalling how the area was chock-a-block full of radiation, undrinkable water, inedible fish, and an environment rendered toxic. But here comes another huge plot twist. The CIA already knew about it. In fact, they uncovered the truth about the Mayak only a few years after the disaster. See, in 1978, the Critical Mass Energy Project acquired 14 redacted CIA documents on the incident, forcing them to admit they'd had prior knowledge. Yep, despite the intense Cold War rivalry between Russia and America, the CIA had actually helped keep the Soviets' dark secret. They'd uncovered the truth through a network of informants and spies who'd brought back aerial photographs of the wreckage. Seeking more evidence, in 1960 they sent a spy pilot to fly over the devastated Mayak site to capture more photos. But the mission went awry when the pilot, Francis Powers, was shot down by Soviet air defense forces. Powers was taken prisoner and sentenced to 3 years in prison for espionage, but was eventually released after 2 years in exchange for a Russian spy. You might be wondering why they'd keep such a dark secret. Surely exposing it would make the Soviets' nuclear program look weak and incompetent, right? The truth is, letting the cat out of the bag would have been just as bad for America's own nuclear program. They kept it concealed not only to protect their classified intelligence sources, but to avoid raising concern over their own nuclear advancements. Ralph Nader, a critic in the 1970s, also theorized that the silence was meant to prevent panic among Americans who live near nuclear facilities in the U.S. Ultimately, as the mountains of evidence kept piling up, Russia had to come clean. Rising health concerns in places like Musliamovo recorded findings of high radiation levels, and of course, the Chernobyl disaster all but forced the government to admit the truth in 1989. At the same time, leader Mikhail Gorbachev also decided it was time to be honest about some of Russia's political and social issues in a policy he called Glasnost, literally openness, which finally allowed for more transparency and insight into the disaster. Interestingly, when the Chernobyl incident struck, those who dealt with the Klishtom disaster discreetly passed on their knowledge of post-emergency procedures. Those responsible for the cleanup in '86 must have been given quite the shock. I imagine it went something like this. Now, it's best to evacuate as quickly as possible and get everyone out of the immediate area. We've dealt with nuclear disasters like this before, you know. You've dealt with what? So finally, everyone was privy to the world's first major nuclear disaster. In fact, on the International Nuclear Event Scale, only Chernobyl and the Fukushima disaster in 2011 were worse, both scoring the maximum level of 7 to Kishtim 6. As for the top-secret health studies, it wasn't until the early 1990s that the real records were made public thanks to Musliamovo doctor Gulfarida Gulamova, who fought for the declassification of patient medical data and uncovered the horrifying experiments. At last, the victims living in villages around Mayak were able to understand what had been happening to them for decades. The results are harrowing, to say the least. In a 1991 report on the people living along the Teka River, it was found that leukemia cases had increased by 41% since 1950. And from 1980 to 1990, all cancers rose by 21%, circulatory system diseases rose by 31%, and birth defects increased by 25%. As if those figures weren't alarming enough, they're probably not even indicative of the true scale of the damage. Local physicians were instructed to limit the number of death certificates issued with diagnosis of cancer and other radiation-related illnesses to protect the experiment's secrecy. What we do know for sure is that the average lifespan in 1993 for the women of Musliamovo was just 47, compared to Russia's average of 72. For men, this figure was 45 compared to the average of 59. And if that doesn't sicken you enough, local authorities at the time kept maintaining that the high level of birth defects and mortality rates were simply due to a lower standard of living. On top of that, in 1992, American scientists observed that radioactive waste was still being dumped into Lake Karachay. Levels in the early 90s were recorded at 120 million curies, and the earth around the lake measured in at 20 curies per kilogram, which might sound comparatively low, but is enough to prove fatal in just 50 minutes. At this, the Russian government finally decided to take action and filled the lake in with concrete, turning it into a permanent dry nuclear waste storage facility, but they only finished the project in 2015. For an even closer look at radiation's impact, Dr. Mira Kosenko conducted a health study in 1994 examining 100 residents that lived in the Teka River area. A staggering 96% of them suffered from at least 5 chronic diseases, including heart disease, high blood pressure, arthritis, and asthma. Even more disturbing, 30% of the participants had as many as 10 conditions. But this isn't the only place in Chelyabinsk that suffered due to toxic pollution. The city of Karabakh, only 27 miles from Mayak, had a copper smelting plant founded in 1910. Each year, over 180 tons of sulfur dioxide, copper, iron, and other metals were pumped into the atmosphere, even polluting the local lake and turning it red. In 1994, a survey conducted by the Chelyabinsk Provincial Institute for Public Health and Environment found that the children in Karabakh had 3.5 times more birth defects and 2.7 times more skin diseases than other children from a control group. Just like Muslimovo, residents have a tragically short life expectancy of just 45 years, and whilst Lake Karachay may be considered the most polluted lake in the world, Karabakh is widely regarded as one of the most polluted cities in the world, especially since the government only cracked down on reducing the factory's harmful emissions in 2010. So whether it's explosions or emissions, you see how this kind of reckless, apathetic behavior from the government has not been about living and learning. Honestly, it's no wonder so many people become sick when pretty much everything around them is irradiated. In 1996, German scientists undertook a study measuring food samples in Muslimovo. They found 17,000 becquerels were present in just 1 kilogram of fish and 8,000 becquerels per kilogram in vegetables. In comparison, products in the rest of Europe measuring more than 600 becquerels are taken off the market altogether. Indeed, one tragic story shows just how poisonous radiation can be to the human body. In the Kishtim area, a baby was found so deformed that some thought it was proof of an alien being. Alyoshenko, also known as the Kishtim Dwarf, was discovered abandoned in the woods in 1996 by a retired woman called Tamara Prosvirina. Prosvirina carried him around with her wherever she went and treated Alyoshenko like he was her own child. However, people around town thought she was losing her mind as it looked like she was walking around with a toy. To be fair, it would have been easy to mistake Alyoshenko for anything. No photos were taken of the child, but according to witnesses, he had a brown body, no hair, large protruding eyes, and a height of only 7 to 10 inches. As a result, everyone started to believe he truly was a mini E.T. Eventually, Prosvirina was taken away to a mental hospital for schizophrenia, and without her there to care for Alyoshenko, the baby sadly didn't make it. These clips supposedly show the remains of the mummified child, but many still claim it's a hoax, with the mummified body being just an aborted fetus. Whilst UFOologists repeatedly speculated that Alyoshenko was an extraterrestrial, it's far more likely that radiation exposure had caused the baby to be born with extreme and rare deformities. But it's a wonder any children were born at all. In the mid-90s, Dr. Galimova estimated that half of the men and women of childbearing age in Muslimovo were sterile, and among the total adult population, only 7% were considered healthy. 7%. Even if you could reproduce, your kid was destined for a life of illness and disease. Galimova discovered that a shocking 90% of Muslimova's children suffered from anemia, fatigue, or immune disorders, while 95% of them suffered from genetic disorders. Sadly, waste from Mayak was still being dumped into the Techno River as late as 2004. The head executive, Vitaly Sadovnikov, was charged for this, but then pardoned by the government in 2006. It seems some governments never learn their lessons, huh? The toll it's taken on Muslimovo itself is expressed in its sinister population figures. In 1950, 8,000 people lived there. By 1990, this had almost halved to 4,500. By 2007, it had fallen even further to 2,500. Even in 2008, over 50 years after the disaster, radiation levels inside homes were 40 times higher than normal. Finally, in 2009, the Russian government decided to relocate the remaining residents. Objects and possessions were buried, and Muslimovo was reduced to rubble, with only a few undocumented individuals left living on its now barren land. Now, you'd think after all that time and all the crap the government had put them through, they'd be whizzed away to a nice apartment and actually taken care of properly. Not a chance. The government offered residents a choice: live in a new home or receive $1 million rubles sum, around $30,000 at the time. Sounds like a fair offer, but in reality it was a lose-lose situation. See, if you took the resettlement option, you were relocated just 1.2 miles down the road to what's now known as New Muslimovo. In other words, still very much in the contamination zone. On the other hand, the majority of people who chose the money could only finance cheap and dingy apartments in Chelyabinsk, and many others never saw the full amount due to the embezzlement and corruption of local officials. In a 2017 interview, a resident of New Muslimovo claimed that several people who live in the area still die every week, most from tumors. With government pardons and ongoing illnesses, it's no surprise that New Muslimovo villagers believe liquid waste is still being dumped into the Techna to this day, dosing them with yet more radiation. The Russian government essentially slapped a band-aid over an infected wound and called it a day. You won't be surprised then that the long-term effects of the disaster are still felt today. The Soviet Health Ministry in Chelyabinsk estimated the death toll at over 8,000 people over a 32-year period, though the true number of deaths is extremely hard to pin down. The legacy of radiation-related illness still haunts the areas around Mayak too. One man, Vatil Batirshkin, who lives in Ozersk, suffers from swollen lymph nodes that have caused his head and neck to enlarge. This condition, a result of the Kishtim disaster and toxic lake contamination, has left his lymph nodes triple the normal size, making it difficult for him to speak. However, it hasn't affected his ability to call Mayak out. He's adamant that he never had this debilitating condition as a child in his hometown, and that it only began to develop when he moved to Ozersk. Although the Mayak facility stopped producing plutonium in 1987, radioactive materials are still floating about in the area. You see, strontium-90 and cesium-137 have half-lives of 29 and 30 years respectively. That's how long it takes for half of the radioactive atoms in these isotopes to decay. However, it'll take an entire 300 years before 99.9% of these radioactive isotopes decay and their concentration levels drop significantly. So yeah, it's gonna be a long time before anyone's setting up coffee shops and condos nearby. After all this horror, the Mayak facility must have been shut down by now, right? Wrong. It's still operational, continuing as a reprocessing site for spent nuclear fuel. But in September 2017, 60 years to the month after the disaster, a cloud of radiation was detected over Europe. More than 1,300 atmospheric measurements from around the globe showed that between 250 and 400 trillion becquerels of radioactive ruthenium-106 had been released. Officially, there's no evidence that it harmed humans, but the total radioactivity measured 3 to 10 times the amount released after the Fukushima catastrophe. Unbelievably, scientists traced the source of the cloud to Mayak, suggesting it could have been caused by a nuclear fuel reprocessing accident at the facility. Russia confirmed that the radioactive cloud was detected, but have yet to admit any responsibility for it. Neither have they acknowledged any nuclear incident at Mayak in 2017. Has history repeated itself? Could Russia be hiding yet another nuclear accident and downplaying its events to the world? It seems only time will tell. Geez, of all the covert cover-ups Russia has pulled, this one has to be a top 5 contender. What do you think of all this? Let me know down in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching.